Welcome to Lesson 2 of the DB2 on Campus lecture series. Today we're going to talk about the DB2 environment, and this is part 1 of 2 parts. My name is Raul Chong and I'm the DB2 on Campus Program Manager. This is the agenda for today. Part 1 will cover an introduction and the topic of instances, and part 2 will cover the rest of the topics. And we will start with the introduction. In the introduction, I'm showing the big picture of DB2. On the left side, I'm showing the commands or statements that you will be executing, and you'll probably be executing them on tools. So the tools are shown in the middle of this slide, and with those statements that are input from the tools, you will be going to the DB2 environment or the DB2 engine, which will process those statements or commands, and it will return the engine. After it processes it, it will return you an output back to the tool. Now in this particular presentation, we're focusing on the DB2 environment. Moving on to the next section, we're now going to talk about instances. So first of all, you should have already installed DB2 on your computer. So what you see right now is this gray box represents your computer with DB2 installed, either on Linux or Windows. Now in the case of Windows, there will be a default instance created with the name of DB2. It could have been called anything else, but it just happens that the default instance is called DB2 on Windows. On Linux, it's called DB2 inst1. Now, what is an instance? An instance is an independent environment where you can start creating your databases inside the instance. You can have an instance, or you can create an instance for production, for test, for development, etc., etc., where each of these instances are independent environments. In the times where maybe there was not enough hardware, you will create instances to separate environments, one for test, one for development, for example. But nowadays that there is more availability of hardware, you may want to put a database on its own instance, on its own machine. So now what I'm showing you is that I can create 2 instances in this computer or in this machine. Of course, you can create many more instances on the same machine if you need independent environments. Normally you don't need to create many instances though. Now the port that you see on each instance is to uniquely identify an instance, and this will be discussed later when we talk about client connectivity, but this port refers to a TCP/IP port, because when we talk about connectivity, we will use basically TCP/IP. Now we will start doing some commands to work with instances, but rather than just showing you slides, let me give you a demo. And to start these, to start working with instances, let's open a DB2 command window. So if you type what you see there, DB2 CMD, and press OK, you will start a window which looks like the MS-DOS prompt, but it's actually not an MS-DOS prompt. If you take a look here at the title of the window, it says DB2 CLP. So make sure it says that, because otherwise things may not work correctly for you. Right, so from this command window, and by the way, if you're working on Linux, just use a Linux shell after, and you are logged on as DB2 inst1 or the instance owner, and then just use a Linux shell. Now going back to the example or to this demo, let's first take a look at the instances that I have created or available right now. So if I type the command db2 ilist, where I stands for instance, list is to list the instances, then I can see that I only have one instance called db2. If I want to create a new instance, I type db2 icrt myinst, right? Assuming that myinst is the name of the instance that I want. So I type db2 icrt myinst, and it should create a new instance called myinst in a few seconds. So if I type now again db2 ilist, I see now that I have 2 instances. One is myinst, the other one is db2. Now which of these instances is the current one that is active for my particular window? Well, if I type the command db2 get instance, it will show me that the instance DB2 is the current active instance for this particular window. So that means whichever command I execute will apply to this particular instance. Now I can switch to another instance, to the other instance, by issuing a operating system set command and using the DB2 instance environment variable, and I can set it to my inst. So if I issue this command, set db2 instance equals my inst, I should be switching to the my inst instance. Note that there is no space between db2 instance, the equal sign, and my inst. There should not be any space, otherwise you will get different results. Now if I type the command db2 get instance again, it should now say that my inst is the current active instance. Okay, great. Now let's create a database on this instance. If I type db2 create db test db and I press enter, first of all I'll get an error because by default on a new instance the instance will not be started. Right? To start the instance I have to type the command db2 start and I press enter, and that should bring up or start the instance. Okay. One thing is to say that the instance is active on this window, which means what I mean here by saying active is that whatever command I execute would apply to this instance, and the other thing is to say that the instance is started, okay, and that means issuing the command db2 start. Alright, so now the instance my inst has been started, so now I can create a database test db on this instance. A database takes a few minutes to create, sometimes 1 or 2 minutes, and the reason for that will be explained later. But basically we are creating some internal tables which are part of what we call the catalog or the dictionary, and we're also doing some configuration as well. So just wait for a few seconds until the database is created. In the meantime, I can open another window by typing db2cmd again. So now I have two windows, and what I want to show in this window is that if I type the command db2 get instance, I will see that this is another window, and in this window the active instance is db2. So that means any command that I execute on this other instance would apply to the db2 instance. And again, you know, db2 is the name of the instance in this case, the one that is used by default, and it could have been called anything else. Okay, it just happened that the first default instance on Windows is called db2, and on Linux, as I said before, is db2 inst1. Now, as you can see from the top window, the database has been created successfully. If I type the command db2 list db directory, it shows me now that I have one database available in this instance, which is called testdb. If I type the same command from the other window, db2 list db directory, I have more information, a bunch of databases: toolsdb, research, sample, and mydb, because I'm looking at the other instance, right? The instance or the window at the top is looking at the myinst instance, the window at the bottom is looking at the db2 instance, and in the db2 instance I had several other databases. Let's just exit from these other windows so we don't get confused. And now that we are back to this window where myinst is the default is the instance that is active right now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the opposite. I will start dropping the database, I will stop the instance, and then I will drop the instance, and I will go back to setting the db2 instance as the active instance. So first we drop a database by issuing the command db2 drop db test db. So we drop the database. Now we're going to stop the instance, so we do a db2 stop command. Now we're going to drop the instance by doing a db2 I drop my inst. So I drop instance drop. right? My instance, I press enter, and now the instance is dropped. So now if I type DB2 list, it will show me that I only have one instance available, which is the DB2 instance. And now I'm going to set back the active instance to DB2. And now if I type DB2 get instance, I'm back to having the DB2 instance as the active instance. So this is a very quick demonstration on working with instances from the command line. Okay, if you didn't understand this, or if you don't like to use a command line, we will show you in the next lessons how to do this using the graphical tools. Now going back to the presentation, we already talked about DB2 create to create an instance. In Linux, to create an instance, you may have to follow a little bit more in terms of the syntax that you need to use, and you need to run it as root. So in Linux, you need two other user or another user, which is a fence user, and these are users from the operating system. Okay, and there is more information in this slide as to other ways to create an instance. You can also create it using the GUI tool from Linux, which is DB2 setup. This I already talked about how to switch instances using the set DB2 instance environment variable and set command. And on Linux, the difference between Windows and Linux, there's not much difference, but one of the main differences is that on Linux, an instance has to map an operating system user. So if I have an instance DB2 inst3, for example, then DB2 inst3 has to map a Linux operating system user, where there will be a /home /DB2 inst3 directory, right? Each of these instances, there will be, for these instances, there will be a file called DB2 profile created, which will be added to normally to the .profile or .login files. And in this DB2 profile file, there will be a call to exporting the variable DB2 instance and setting it to the right instance name, which in this case is DB2 inst3. Now, depending on the shell, the name may change. It may be DB2 profile. It may be DB2 ch, depending on if you're using a C shell or a Bourne shell. Okay. Now, so if you're in Linux, then you can also just su to switch user to the other instance, and that would imply that .profile or .login files will be executed automatically, which would execute the DB2 profile file, which would execute the export or set DB2 instance equals to the other instance. So that's so just by switching users in Linux, you would be also switching to another instance. In Windows, on the other hand, you don't need to map a user to an instance. You create an instance from a given user, and that's it. It doesn't have to map a user on Windows. And to change instance, you just use the set command as shown on the demo. On this slide, we show the DB2 list command, which I mentioned before, to list all instances on the server, and DB2 get instance to show which one is the current active instance on the particular window. To stop and start a instance, you issue to stop is DB2 stop, and to start is DB2 start. Now I show the option force in DB2 stop, and that will do, what that will do is if you had any connections on databases within an instance, those connections would be forced. That means they will be brought down, and then the instance would be stopped. Right? Of course, you probably don't want to do this in production, or at least you have to give a warning that you will doing this, because many people will get upset if you do a force on their connections. To drop an instance, you have to stop the instance using DB2 stop, and then use DB2 drop as shown in the demo before. And on Linux is the same procedure. The next section to talk about is databases, but that will be covered in the next part 2. So this concludes part 1 of the DB2 environment. Please continue with part 2. Thank you.